Sounding Crisis, the research project on climate change and sound.
Welcome, everybody. And thank you so much, Jake, for being willing to carve out this slice of time to talk with us. As you might know, we have this Energies Consciousness reading group, and we're kind of going through these different sort of progressions in ideas of how energies come into play in humanities, but also in terms of some of our individual areas of research. And now we're in this sort of energies and animism section after going through like a real heavy like science section. And so it's been really like interesting to read like Tim Ingold and then also go into Milford Graves' writing, which is pretty wild. But just in terms of who Jake is a composer and a filmmaker, among other things. I've known him for a while through mutual music, scenes and friends. And he is, I think you're like, are you like the resident percussionist at Smith, or how does that?
I think my title is dance musician.
Dance musician. Okay. Yeah. It's so cool. Yeah. So he works at Smith College, which is in Amherst, Massachusetts, where we all kind of know each other from. But I was like looking at your like bio, I didn't actually realize like how much you like exhibit your work in all these different museums too. So I'll just let you all know a little bit about him. He is a New Music Award winner and Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellow in both music and film, and has collaborated and performed with an extraordinary range of musicians, including Milford Graves, Alvin Lucier, Joan LaBarbera, Kim Gordon, Vic Rawlings, many people, Thurston Moore, Bill Nace, Paul Flaherty, and others. And his work has been presented widely and internationally, including Institute for Contemporary Art in London, in the Tusk Festival in Newcastle. Man, this is like a long list. So one of the things I was also noticing in your bio is a number of your exhibitions and screenings and performances, and so a lot of these sound like they have something to do with Milford Graves' area of an interest too, like Emergent Improvisation Project at the Neuroscience Institute, right? In Roulette in New York, Heart Sound Music with Organic Graphics. So Jake is like both a practitioner, but also like somebody who has had a really close relationship with Milford, and also made the documentary that we all watched called Full Mantis, among several other short documentaries as well. And so, yes, so welcome to Jake. And I think what we will maybe start off by doing is looking at, I think maybe we'll watch one of the shorter documentaries that you made in collaboration, Jake, and then because I think we realized after the fact that it actually, those two really have a lot to do with energies. So I think some of us are curious about a number of things, and I would like to start, but I would like to encourage other people to, maybe we just use the hand raising, the good old fashioned caricature hand. Yeah, I was just wondering, what are the things, Jake, what do you think, like you made these incredible films that kind of like use techniques to translate what Milford's talking about, but what are the things that you feel like can't be translated, or are there things that you feel like can't be translated that, because do you want to give us like, I'm sorry, I'm being a little jumbled. Do you like to give us a little like context of what your relationship has been over the years with Milford Graves?
Sure. Firstly, thank you, Jenny, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here and having me. This seminar looks awesome, and the reading list is amazing. I haven't dug into it, but I'm curious to look at all the conversations you've had and the work you've been doing. So grateful to be here. And my relationship with Milford, those of us who study with Milford call him the professor. Many people in his neighborhood also call him the professor, and longtime friends call him the professor. So I'll probably refer to him as the professor sometimes. And when I say prof or something, I mean Milford Graves. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a city a bit south of here, and I was started playing drums around, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old, and had a great teacher, Billy Arnold, who played with Billie Holiday, and he was a postman in my neighborhood, and we had lessons with like 2 drum sets back, in his attic. And he taught me to play and learn with like putting speakers behind my head, which was like how he was taught to play also. So like playing and playing records and kind of playing along with records was like a big, kind of the main way we learned. We weren't like looking at charts or reading music or anything. We were just like playing together and playing with records. And yeah, when you're a drummer and you're playing drum set, and I was playing in like jazz band in my junior high school and high school, I started, listening to all the great drummers and buying those records. And, eventually you go to a record shop enough times looking at records that feature like the major drummers of American music history. You eventually get past like a Milford Graves record that you like probably can't afford because they're so rare. But luckily for me, the person at the record shop burned me a CD of Milford's record called Percussion Ensemble, which was the first all improvised, all drum record I'd ever heard. This is from 1964. It's on a label called ESP, which released a lot of great kind of underground New York City music, a lot of free jazz, but also just experimental. The experimental scene in the 60s was documented by this guy named Bernard Stolman, who was a lawyer in the Bronx who lived with his mom and just dedicated his life to putting out this music, kind of labor of love, small run. So I heard this record and I was just like blown away because one, it was impossible to try to follow along and learn like the licks because it was so complex and rich and dense musically. It was Prof and this other drummer named Sonny Morgan, who we was working with in the early 60s, playing 2 drum sets, very fast, very asymmetrical, not much like ostinato Lyceum music or repetition, but lots of kind of circular motion, and it was just impossible to tell who was playing what. And so it was kind of a provocation to play along as like a third improviser. I remember it that way now. I don't know if I totally like registered it then, but what I would do was just like get really excited and to just play my drums in a way that I'd never played before and kind of imagine myself in dialogue with the music, which wasn't quite what I was doing up to that point. I was kind of trying to figure out what Elvin Jones did or what another drummer did and kind of copy it. So it was an early sense of myself as an improviser and as like a composer, or just that something that I would come out of me would be something that to develop rather than trying to figure out how to kind of impress people or my teacher by figuring out something that someone else did. So I became a huge fan, essentially. This is like, at 15, 16 years old, and, found ways to listen to everything that Milford did. And in about 20 years ago now, maybe 19 years ago, so like 2001, maybe it was 2002, I went and saw him. He played at a series that was called Solos Duos at UMass, and it was which is the university north of where I live, and I got to see really great musicians there. Ed Blackwell, who played with Ornette Coleman, was part of this series. Sonny Murray, another Sonny drummer, who was another, iconic, huge figure in free jazz, played this same series, and Milford played solo. And I was studying with another person from my neighborhood, Joe Platts, who was a conguero, a conga player, who was also an Ifa priest. And I had been studying with him there was a thing in my neighborhood called the Community Music School, which I would go to after school, and lots of great conga players and other players from the Afro-Latin community in Springfield were teaching there. And if you played in like band at school, you could sometimes get like a scholarship to go study. So me and Joe went to see Milford together, and I was just completely blown away, because it was the first one. I was a fan, but I had no idea what it would be like to be in the room with the music and with the person. And it was about an hour-long performance, and at the end, when the lights turned on, like everyone around me, like their faces were flushed. They were talking about like sensing their heartbeat. Milford had picked people up off the crowd. He had 2 people on his back at once. And when we were talking afterwards, everyone was talking about like this kind of transformative element of the music. And that was really just a magical, formative experience, to kind of really feel music as not entertainment, not kind of something to identify with necessarily socially, which, I think there was elements of music as energy in punk music and other things I was interested in, but this was kind of like, it was so clear that like what happened was about an energy transfer, and had elements of healing and transformation, and it was just a new vision of what music could be. So after that, I just decided I would just like quit my job and drive to Milford's office and kind of present myself as a potential student. I didn't enroll at Bennington College at the time. I just waited by his office on the day that I found out that he was teaching there, and I said, I'm here to study with you and help out any way I can. And it was kind of a naive move now, being 20 years older, but it turned out to be a really amazing life change. I was very nervous. I actually did throw up later that night. I think I had built up so much kind of anxiety and just energy to make this decision, and to kind of choose to take this big step. And I think I worked myself into a little bit of a state. But to my great surprise, he met me with a ton of generosity. He looked me up and down and said, well, we'll see what the story is, and invited me in. And the first thing we did together before we talked was play. He played piano and I played drums. And he stayed pretty quiet. He said, come back again tomorrow. And but within a month, he had the school, Bennington, hire me as his assistant, and I started teaching the intro to percussion classes. I think it ended up that I really had the right background with the way I was trained, with like this combination of being connected to someone like Billy, who was like deep inside a kind of an oral tradition of jazz drumming, and also be in a neighborhood where liturgical Afro-Cuban music was happening, and also rarely now I see being kind of taught at the Community Music School of Springfield. And so I had some enough background to kind of deliver the intro percussion classes the way Prof wanted them. And he was only at Bennington for 24 hours a week. I mean, it was kind of wild. He would drive up from Queens on Tuesday morning and then teach 4 classes in 24 hours. So this was like, he would teach from 2 to 4, from 4 to 6, from 6 to 8. Then we would do one-on-one lessons till like 2 in the morning. And then the next day he would teach a class from like 9 a.m. to 11. And then he would get in the car and drive back to Queens, where he stayed the rest of the week. And he taught, free martial arts classes and drumming, and worked in his laboratory in his basement for the rest of the week. So once I started working as his assistant, we became close, and had these one-on-one kind of mentorship relationship. I started running his laboratory at the school, maintaining it, taking student heartbeats, and arranging the data so he could put it into his LabVIEW program and process it. And then over the years, those first like 5 or 6 years, he started asking me to make things. If he had a lecture somewhere, he would ask me to make a kind of a video PowerPoint of the garden. Other times I would be doing things like doing live footage from his garden while he played, like the roulette thing. That's a Milford title, the heart sounds with graphics. That was a show where he wanted me to improvise with video with him, as a, just asking me to be part of his band essentially. But that made it so there was like a hard drive that I started having lots of different like images and sounds that were kind of part of this creative process. And because I was studying with him at like 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. alone, and lots of folks that Jenny and I both know, like my friend Bill Nace and Thurston Moore, and people who I lived near, and who were huge fans of Milford's, I wanted to be able to kind of tell them what was going on. So I asked Milford, could I record some of these lessons just so I can kind of process this stuff and document it? And he gave me permission to do that really early in our relationship. And I would make like mixtapes for my friends using little bits of what he was talking about, and all that together like started to create like a hard drive that had a lot of information in it. And at a certain point, there was a couple points in time where he would have an article in the New York Times or something like that, and a documentarian would get interested and show up at the house with like a crew, like more funded kind of filmmaking things. And the 2 times that I witnessed that, it just failed miserably, in the sense that like the rapport was weird, and then the cuts that they kind of offered to Milford to look at were so kind of out of tune with what was actually happening at the house, and he was just like, don't let them back at the house, kind of thing. So maybe I don't know, 8 or 9 years before Full Mantis came out, we kind of decided together, like, maybe we can do this, like we could just do a film, like a feature-length film ourselves. And that became a labor of love on my part that, it gained momentum over time, and then turned into Full Mantis. And then after Full Mantis came out in 2018, I remained kind of, that year is when he got more, his amyloid protein condition of his heart became, the prognosis became more bleak, and his just physical health started to deteriorate more. And during that time, I was living here in Northampton, and I would drive down on weekends and spend time with him, and kind of in and out of hospitals, and then also like the aftermath of the movie, creating all these new opportunities in galleries. And there was a show at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philly that then went to the Artist Space in New York. And a lot of other kind of things started happening around his work that I just was helping to facilitate and helping to realize. And so Graves in the Garden came out of that period, post Full Mantis. That was actually the last summer of his life, where he was no longer really like able to work the land in the garden. So every Sunday, lots of students would come over, and like he would tell people what to do with the garden. So my partner Sarah Lanzalotta and I got a bunch of 16 millimeter film and just decided to try to shoot in the garden, thinking about light and just the kind of the sunlight. And it turned out that the day that we were there, he was kind of talking to the people that were there about Osayin, the Orisha, Yoruba, and Afro-Latin Orisha of herbs and healing, and was kind of putting his own words to that tune. And that's the song you hear him play. And then the recording of gongs was that summer. We were also going through old reel-to-reels for a deal he was making with a record label, and we found a recording that was just all gongs on reel-to-reel from like the early 60s, and that's the music that's kind of behind him.
Thanks. That was like a really incredible story. I guess you've been telling, like, you kind of have it down, but that's like a really amazing arc. But it also must be like, I mean, I don't want to get too segued into this, but I mean, it must be really hard to know like where to let go of being that keeper of information and conveyor of information. Are you like involved in that process still, or?
Yeah, I'm very close with the family, so I'm part of a group of people, including like very long-time Yara students, people in the neighborhood, Milford's granddaughter, Tatiana, his daughter, Renita. He kind of gave us all our own instructions
Okay.
on our roles, and we also just work it out between us all. So this is like the work that chose me in a way. Like I didn't set out to make the film. Again, it was more of an emergent process. Like I loved film, and I was like a huge fan of film and cinema. 90, 80 minutes to like 120 minutes pieces of film, but I never really saw myself that way. Films of that, like the kind that would go to movie theaters and play, in front of like audiences inside cinemas, that seemed to be something that people did far away from where I grew up. And it wasn't something I had the confidence to say, like, I'm going to make a feature-length documentary. It was more like a process that emerged out of the relationship, and really, like, you mentioned when you were introducing, or after the film showed, like the idea of like technique and translation, and a lot of it was like I was studying with Milford, so I was studying music, but also just life and approaches to living, and so it became a way, like just like the mixtapes I was making, it became a way to kind of deepen and add more texture to the lessons that I was like learning. So it's not necessarily, I don't see it as a translation per se, but it's more like the film is polyrhythmic, like while we're studying polyrhythm, like I was like seeking to apply that, kind of like how John Cage says, like, it should be like nature, but in its manner of operation, like it wasn't like a film about polyrhythm. It was like, I wanted all those things to be the film. So so ideas of like tension and release, and like Milford always talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system and this oscillation that we kind of live inside. Like you could analyze the film through that perspective, and I think you would find a lot, of anytime there's like a moment of a parasympathetic release, the next scene, is going to have a more sympathetic nervous system kind of response. There's a way to look at the film through polyrhythm. There's a way to think of the film through the idea of like healing. So it's like the film was like it was like a big lesson for me in amongst other lessons. And then the aftermath of the film was like this amazing opportunity to travel around the world with Milford and talk about the film. And often the audience would be like really wanting to know a lot more about him and his work, and just kind of being part of that process of introducing him to a lot of people and kind of being in dialogue with him with this piece. So yeah, as far as like letting go, I think I do feel connected and responsible to my great teacher, and I essentially I report to his family, and there's things that I'm involved in, there's things I'm not involved in at all, and there's also like a really cool, one of the great parts of like doing Full Mantis was going around the world and meeting all different people that had studied with him at different points, or were deeply affected, or had met him or played with him in a European tour, or across the States, and starting to kind of have a community of people who I'm very much still connected with. So there's times where it kind of something generates, and I work on that for a couple of weeks, and then maybe a couple months where I'm not involved in the archive or the work. But yeah, I mean, it's still very much alive, and I'm still very much connected to the family, and to his wife Lois, who now lives at the house, and there's still groups of us who go and do the garden. And
nice. I see that Anya has her hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering if you maybe could tell a little bit more about the garden and about the, you said there were lessons that you learned yourself, and that you also were part of the band by adding the sounds of the garden to his concerts, if I understood that correctly. And can you maybe tell a little bit more about what exactly you did with the sounds of the garden, and what role the garden plays in Milford Graves' aesthetics and his research, artistic research? I think that he describes it quite well, what he does, in my opinion. And I would like to understand a little bit better what role the garden plays.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And like I said, the garden's still very much alive. And well, first off, that house, for those of you who saw Full Mantis, he describes this in the movie, but in 1971, I think it was, he inherited that house from his grandmother. And he grew up in the housing projects across the street from that house, called the South Jamaica Houses. And then from 1962, when he left his mom's apartment, to 1971, he was living in different neighborhoods with his very fast growing family, with 5 children eventually by the 71, in different situations in Brooklyn, and mostly Brooklyn. Not Queens, but where South Jamaica is where JFK Airport is. So it's right on the border between Brooklyn and Queens. And he inherited that house, and the mortgage was paid. So this was like a big moment, I think, in his life as an artist, because all of a sudden he had a place to work and a place to do his music, and he didn't have to pay. rent. In New York City, that's a kind of an amazing thing. So his grandmother had this house since like the 30s, and his grandmother's partner, who he sometimes referred to as his grandfather, had worked that land and turned. I mean, it's a small plot. I don't really reveal that in any of the films. It's a New York City. It's a dense urban neighborhood, and but the garden is so rich and complex with life that, like, at night when you take a walk around the neighborhood, you can hear the insect life, and during the day you can walk away from the garden and kind of the sound of the birds that live there in that specific plot is so loud. It's kind of like its own. It's on a corner, busy corner. I showed the corner a little bit in that last film, 156 in Brinkenhoff. So he inherited the garden also from his grandfather. In Full Mantis, it's articulated more, but that metal structure that he calls Ogun, which is another deity from the Yoruba religion of Ifa, and through the diaspora in the Caribbean, Ogun is the deity of metal, and he took all his grandfather's tools and built that structure out of the rusted tools that had been left in one of the sheds. The garage he turned into what's referred to by his students as the temple, which is where he trained Yara for 50 years. And still now, Lois, his wife, opens that space up for Yara practitioners in the neighborhood to work. So the garden, if you watch Full Mantis, I start the film with a quote. It was the first thing he said to me when I came to his house, which was kind of, he asked me to sit down in the garden with him, and he said, look at the garden, look at the room downstairs. Don't try to analyze it, just take it in. Was my instruction. I offered it to the viewers of Full Mantis as an instruction on how to watch the film. And it was also like my instruction as a filmmaker to, on how to kind of approach the material. And that day I sat in the corner, and it was like this very, multi-dimensional sonic experience where you had like all the cars and trucks moving on the backside. You had the Long Island Railroad train on on my left side, and then the New York City subway system. So, and then you had all the sounds of the bees, of the birds, of the life inside the garden happening also. And then you had the sound of the neighborhood, which is very loud. Again, this is like right across the street from a very densely populated housing project. So there's just lots of sounds of people, of talking, really loud car stereos, bass from parties. It's next to a big park where there's like a lot of barbecues, and just a lot of different sonic life. And that was a formative listening experience. So in reference to your question, when I mentioned the garden as far as like playing in live, a live capacity with Prof, I meant the video film from the garden. So not sound. He never asked me to use sound from the garden in a live context. I used a lot of sound from the garden in the films that I made. In Full Mantis, there was just countless hours of just taking a field recorder and going close to different insects and flowers and birds and recording the life of the garden over the seasons. That's in Full Mantis and also in Graves in the Garden. When we would perform live, we would do like time lapse of plants growing, and his would like be on a big screen behind him. So I would be like improvising with like a kind of VJ type software and just playing with flowers and birds and images from the garden and from Bennington, where we had a garden. And there's another garden called the George Washington Carver Garden that he founded. It's also in South Jamaica, Queens, that him and a lot of his Yara practitioners built. It's now the community garden of the neighborhood. George Washington Carver was a Black inventor who is, I have a great story that Milford told that never made it on any film yet, but it was kind of like this idea that like he learned of George Washington Carver. You learn about that in Black American history as like the inventor of peanut butter. But George Washington Carver, and he said, when I first heard about it, I was like, peanut butter is like the peanuts person who sells peanuts in the neighborhood. It doesn't seem like kind of someone to pay close attention to, but like over time, George Washington Carver, he held lots of patents, including peanut butter, but also other kinds of botanical, contributions to botany and to science through plants. And he always maintained that he talked to plants throughout his career, and so Milford really took that to heart as a lesson, and would talk about going to the garden and touching each plant and trying to see what the plant's asking for, listening, essentially to plants. And George Washington Carver was an influence, and the garden that's next door to Milford's house, which is a community garden maintained now by the I think the Jamaica Queens Parks and Recs committee, or like a community garden committee, that was named after George Washington Carver by Milford. And yeah, I spent lots of time learning to garden with Milford. I then, I made my own garden in Bennington. I had my older daughter, Lena, who's now 23, when she was little, she would crawl around and eat from the plants, with me and Milford, and not touch the plant, just like you see him eat the plant in Full Mantis, the water spinach. And, he often talked about like gardening in preparation for making music and drumming, and like the idea that like when you do something like touch a plant and touch the ground and touch the earth and cultivate food that you're feeding your family, that you're kind of training your hands to touch in a way that has a lot of meaning and a lot of depth, as opposed to working out in a more kind of physical fitness or physical training. Like, in drumming, you have lots of rudiments and lots of exercises that are meant to kind of make your hands hold sticks or hit drum heads in a more ergonomic way. And Milford was kind of, I think, opposed to this kind of training and this kind of technique. You can actually see it in his drumming. And we talked about this before he passed. And I can say, like, he what I was kind of putting forth, he was resonating for him, but I was kind of commenting on how he never went that way with his drum technique. Like, a lot of times you see drummers who are very fast, they're often using bouncing techniques. In rudiments, you have rolls, double stroke rolls, ways of using smaller muscles to make more drum hits and kind of create speed. Milford always used very big sticks, and he never did any double stroke rolls. Every time he hits, it's like coming from the larger muscles. It's not very efficient in drum training. And also, he would keep the heads of his drums very loose, so you kind of are pressing into the head. Again, not really beneficial to obtaining like an ergonomic speed around the kit. So every time you hear a drum hit by Milford, he's kind of like digging it out of the drum in a way, and it creates another kind of sound. So the speed that you hear with him, it's one hit for every one stroke, as opposed to ways of having five, ways of kind of manipulating and using physics with your hand and the drumstick and your muscles to kind of let the stick do a lot of the work itself. It's almost like a lot of drum technique has this kind of basketball dribbling. I don't want to get too in the weeds on drum stuff, but so he talked a lot about the relationship between touch and doing things with your hands that have a lot of meaning. And the garden was very much that. And I'll say, like, he was a very high level cook. Like the flavors that I experienced at his house, I've never experienced in any, even remotely anywhere else. He would make, food that had, 30 different herbs, so, and very like pungent herbs combined with spice, combined with like sweet. I mean, his cooking style was very much like his music, very dense, very rich, very multifaceted, and completely singular and original. So there was also that element. A big part of coming to his house and working and studying was like a group meal. Always, anyone who came to the house, he would always be cooking for, and that was a big, part of his family culture was having food together with all the different students that would come over. So I don't know if that answered the question, but just a
I was just thinking about, there's so many things, but in the film Full Mantis, there's like a part in there where he's talking about how, it was something like he wanted to learn martial arts, some type of martial arts, but he couldn't get access to it because the people, I don't know where he was, like the people who had that knowledge, they weren't willing to open up to him. And I don't know if that was like an issue of, racism, or if that was a cultural, where that was, but it was just making me think about like the garden and all of his sort of his very unique sort of self-created laboratories of like all the laboratories, from the garden to the basement garden to and how maybe he also had to, because he mentions that he had to learn from the praying mantis itself. He had to buy those mantises so that he could learn on his own. And it's just making me think about Anya's question in terms of maybe also this not having to formulate your own knowledge, and also with this whole kind of coming from the African diaspora, where you're kind of having to like reinvestigate or reformulate a body of knowledge that was maybe some of it was lost, or and having to do that on your own terms. I'm just wondering if some of that relationship was even more pronounced because he's like, he had to forge it out on his own, because it wasn't like just being offered to him. I don't know, but I have a question that has to do with the actual like laboratory, because that's something that we don't get to see that much of exactly what he's doing with the heartbeats. Like the first time I saw him play, someone introduced him or said, oh, he's a sound healer. And I was always curious, like, how did he work with people with their heartbeats to kind of, my understanding is that he like played rhythms to people to kind of influence the heart, or am I not understanding that correctly? Or how did he, do you have this understanding of like how he was working with the heart rhythms?
Yeah, I can kind of tell you what I know. I think at that process of the way he would deal with someone who approached him for like his healing practice, had a lot of creativity, and that part of it I might not be able to talk about so in so much detail, but essentially, Milford had never had it or used a computer before. I think it was, I don't know, 1998 or something like that. The year he got his Guggenheim grant, and he asked someone after he got the grant, what program do I need to learn in order to analyze heartbeat sounds? And they told him LabVIEW. So LabVIEW is this engineering program that is used to analyze low frequency vibration. It's used in bridge engineering. It has other applications. It's not typically a music production. There's a plane behind me. I'm not sure how loud that is, but it's not typically a musical production piece of software. It's graphical programming, similar to Max, but most of the VIs are for visual analysis and data analysis and not for sound generation. It's very rudimentary as far as the kind of sound that it generates. It's just using kind of pure electronic sine waves. So essentially he was using kind of and experimenting essentially with biofeedback. So he's a self-taught acupuncturist, so he's dealing with kind of channel theory in traditional Chinese medicine, and studying through the kind of evolution of traditional Chinese medicine through German practitioners who started to use electricity and in the needles, and was kind of using those kinds of methods, but instead of just charging the needles with kind of random voltage, he was taking the audio from the heartbeat and essentially sonifying it into an audible range, processing it in with basically his own code, which was applying the golden ratio and other kinds of algorithmic ideas to kind of perform the sonification from the low frequency audio vibration of the heart into sine wave melodies. And this was completely original in the sense that he was analyzing the heartbeat not as two peaks, which is essentially what you hear when you hear an EKG. You're hearing the peak of the double hit. He was analyzing all the audio, and if you watch a heart, you can see this. There's multiple valves. They're operating in kind of a kind of musical canon kind of way. One's happening, in microseconds after another, and lots of movement in between the peaks. So he was analyzing all of that audio, and actually doing kind of a normalization process, in which he would take the audio that was normally very low and bring it up to the same level as the peak audio. And inside that, you would get these kind of really interesting melodies, and he would use that audio through a regular amplifier, and then out of that amplifier, electricity would charge the needle. So this was a very experimental process, but he had lots of patients.
So he was going out, sorry to interrupt you, but he was going out of one's own heartbeat back into the body. And what was his idea of what that was supposed to be?
So biofeedback. So like essentially taking information that the body's generating and using it in a channel theory way. Okay. The way acupuncture works, of kind of opening up different pathways in the body, different pathways of energy, and kind of using, and also then playing that audio for people, and having them listen to it in a kind of sound healing way. When you talk to people like my friend Lavender Suarez, who's a sound healer, like as far as I understand it, a big part of that practice is also like creating for the patient like sonic environments that are beneficial to their own process of self-development, of relaxation, of kind of opening up space for healing. And as far as I'm not an acupuncture practitioner, but as far as my understanding of the way shiatsu and acupuncture work in traditional Chinese medicine and other kinds of somatic practices like massage therapy, and it has to do with working with the patient, working with the patient's body and energy to open up space for healing that the body will kind of do naturally when certain blockages or pathways are cleared and opened. So he was experimenting with low frequency, with his basement was filled with subwoofers, so like there was a very kind of atypical sonic experience to be surrounded by 3 or 4 4,000 watt subwoofers. That in itself had an element of touch, in that you were kind of vibrating your body. So yeah, he was a self-taught, unaccredited by the whatever accrediting Chinese medicine does, but very much practiced in his neighborhood, and people who had chronic illness, who had other types of issues, would come and see him, and he would treat them.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Aquila has a comment question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for being here and also for your movie. I think just also what you said, that you started with a quote that just take it and don't try to analyze it. I think from sort of like the audience point of view, I think you also kind of did something like that in the movie, just sort of inviting into that world. And yeah, I really like that. I think what I wanted to maybe hear more about is like personally what was for me really inspiring in that movie was that Milford's connection to plants and, well, nature, if it's somehow more abstract, but like the way he talks about plants, it seemed to me like he's sort of exemplifying how being more connected to that environment, plants and nature, is actually helping to bring the highest human potential and creativity, right? And it's kind of this, if we think more from like the Western world, where you think a lot about these binaries, he really sort of shows this different way of actually it is not contradiction. It's like the more we are connected to the natural environment, the better versions of humans and the most potential creativity we can find ourselves. So I was wondering if you can maybe elaborate more on that and just give some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you said, and that resonates with me, quite a bit. I think, yeah, and what I tried to get at in the Graves in the Garden film too, which is kind of almost an extension of the garden footage in Full Mantis in a way. It's the same space, just a few years later, is that sense of connectedness and kind of the transformative quality that connectedness can have. So yeah, I mean, this is getting more into like my own kind of thoughts about this stuff. What Milford said a lot was just like about like just looking at the plant, tasting it, experiencing it, using your sensorium to like let it in. And I think that's like a big part of a big part of this idea like of porousness in our body and our sensorium as a porousness. And I think there's like this idea of like, I think sound oftentimes can be like a way into this way of thinking because it so obviously crosses those borders, both through our eardrum and vibrating our tympanum and kind of creating electrical signals in our brain, but also the kind of very easily felt sense of touch that sound can have, especially lower frequency sound, but all sound can have on your sensation on your skin and your organs and the way it kind of can place itself in different areas in your body. So yeah, I think about, I've been thinking a little bit lately about, I've been having conversations with my friend Christoph Cox, who's a philosopher of sound. He lives here too, and he helped a lot with the movie and like watched it a lot of times in its earlier forms. He's the editor of the book Audio Culture, if anyone's like looked at that. But he's one thing I'll say too is just like this movie came out of this community in a lot of ways. Like where I live in Western Mass, there's just by fortune, because I was born here, there's just a lot of interesting people that live around here. I'm not quite sure why. It's nothing really remarkable. I mean, it's nice, but so Christoph is a philosopher. He just did a book on materialism and sound called Sonic Flux, but he's been talking a lot about Stoicism and like early Greek philosophy and Milford and kind of the way there's like these connections in his interests in philosophical history. But I was thinking about the Jewish theologian Martin Buber and like this idea of like I, thou, and I, it, and how that does kind of change this or like kind of disturb this duality when you have this kind of sense that everything that you're looking at has this kind of godly quality or this like exalted quality, and you're looking to kind of be impacted and affected and changed by all the encounters you have with nature. How that just puts it kind of puts you close to everything. And I mean, I think even like with the garden, it's like I have this footage that I didn't use at all because the lighting was so harsh because the sun was so bright that day. But it's just, we're both gardening and I have the camera really low, but it's like you're like right on the ground, you know? So like this, which is so different than like standing up on 2 feet and like looking, you know, looking out at a pretty picture of nature. There's something about like being on all fours and being close to the earth and like sensing like your own gravity that way, and kind of looking at things from that perspective and touching things from that perspective. So yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot in the way Milford talked and lived, and like the way he created his home inside the city, you know, like really that's what's kind of really, he never like left his neighborhood to do this. He kind of created this laboratory to experience nature, that all that bamboo, you know, he planted there that surrounds the garden and creates a whole other bird life that's high. But yeah, I think there's something about sound, and for me as well, like just being an artist who like focuses on sound. I think it gives you a way into this kind of like perspective that you are always being changed by the things you encounter, and that there's a porousness in your selfhood, and that kind of like clinging to like a very individualistic way of seeing yourself kind of prevents you from that transformative element that happens when you kind of can sense like the changes that happen when you let someone else, another person, a plant, an animal, anything more than yourself, kind of letting that in. And I think there's something also about like being close. I think that's why I was thinking about being on all fours and being like the touch element. Like sound really does that for you. Like going to see Milford, 20 years ago, it's like I was like maybe 8 rows back, but it's like that all that sound was like entering my body, like and I think with plants, like that's what's so magical about like eating the plant. It's like he prepared that plant, he planted it, he chose where it was, and now I'm putting it into my body. I'm putting that whole history of that relationship is now like inside me.
Great. It's like an energy transference. I mean, he's talking so much in this piece that we read about, just all about transduction, like really, and just all the different variations of how it happens through the skin, through the eardrum membrane, and conscious and subconscious ways. So it's really cool. So Holger has a comment question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, again, also from me, a big thank you for crafting this movie and for sharing time with us today. I have a question I like to dig deeper into how you think Milford and yourself, he understood, how you understand what energies actually encompass, what that includes all. Because these days, in the, let's say, in the big company world, in the big political world, when they speak about energies, they mean coal, electricity, oil extraction, driving machines. However, obviously, we all speak in colloquial language about the energy of a room, energy of a presentation, of a performance, or interaction, all these sorts of stuff. And these are almost, it can seem as if two different things. And as far as I know, this whole field of energy studies and raising energy consciousness tries to take back or steal back this term of energies to this broader notion from the economical use. So my question to you would be, um, having seen the movie, having heard you speaking about your time with Milford Graves, and also yeah, get a notion about this expanded idea of energies, how would you describe his concept or his understanding of energies? Because it sounds to me like, on the one hand, there's nature, the garden, musical practices, and of course also martial arts and other elements. And this is almost, which I find really interesting, it's like one thing. It's like not separated, whereas in most conversations of everyday nature, you would say that's a pretty different things. Being in a garden, doing martial arts, and performing on stage, pretty different things. However, in what ways could you explicate, maybe from your closer experience, how he understand this as one form of energy, if it's possible? I know it's a huge question.
Yeah, no, thank you for the provocation, and I mean, and just thank you for the invitation. I can say, like, I'm unfamiliar with like the dialogue of what energy studies as a field is, so I'm kind of talking from a very blank place, which maybe that's helpful. And I do appreciate like the way you kind of contextualize this of like, you know, the field as like taking back this word and kind of connecting it to this broader experience of the world, not tied to kind of economics of society. So I you know, I appreciate the opportunity to think about this. You know, I can say one of the early lessons I got from Prof was when you're playing on stage to sit down and be quiet and listen to the energy of the room. And he would call that sometimes like taking the tone of the room, finding the tone of the room, and letting that in. I think there is this like and I don't mean to be like too kind of like esoteric, but like this idea of porousness and like the letting in of what's out was like a big part of that. And I mean, I immediately learned the power of that as far as being a performer myself, of kind of having this moment to sense the tone of the room, the energy of the room. And I guess, you know, given this like prompt, I could probably go through like my hours and hours of footage and hard drives and find really interesting things that kind of, and maybe this is a good idea for a new way of entering the hard drives. You know, here's another memory that I'll share. I think I shared this video with Jenny. I may have not, but one really like fascinating part of this process, this most recent part of the process, is that the film is going to be released on the Criterion Collection in the next year, and they invited me to make new content. So I used some time at a residency recently to start that process of making the new content, and it was really fascinating because I was going through footage that I hadn't seen for 16, 17 years, you know, and re-looking at it. And there was this one clip, and it was shot not on just very cheap cameras. It was me and my friend Marcus had gone down, and we were in the basement with him, and the lighting was kind of weird. And I used a bit of this footage. It's in the beginning of the film. Prof is playing a drum called the ashiko drum. It's black and white. It's kind of lit kind of harshly. There's like a xylophone behind him. It's the footage where he's kind of dancing in quietude to the sounds of the applause from a show from much longer. But I had remembered that there wasn't much inside this footage, and it was kind of like there was this one little section that I used in the movie, but that tape itself was about 4 hours long. And I went back and looked at it, and I think I wasn't totally present to what was happening, because the whole thing is like this exploration of energy in this way of he starts off by talking about like what happens as your hand moves closer to the drum, and as it gets closer, how the kind of the energy from the drum, you can start to feel its presence before you touch. And he was talking about low frequencies and the way if you play drums and there's light, how you can use the light and the way the light is hitting the dust to start to kind of get a visualization of the music that you're making. And it was just amazing. I think I was actually very focused that day on trying to contextualize his work with Min Tanaka, and I kept asking him about that, and he was interested in this other thing. And then what happened that day at the end of the session was there was an earthquake in New York City. It happened in Virginia, but it resonated all the way up to New York City. And we were filming at the time. And before the earthquake happens, he says, like, I'm feeling that there's something happening. There's something happening with the drum. And then all of a sudden stuff starts falling off the wall, and then I turn the camera off, because I wasn't that great of a documentarian, and then we went outside and the fire hydrants were exploded, and it was a wild day. But it was this kind of, when I went back and looked at it, the whole day was kind of about the energy of the earth and the way it kind of manifests through the drum, and how you can kind of develop a sensitivity towards what the drum is asking for and what's happening in the room. So as far as me, I think of this idea of like taking the tone of the room per se, like I think that part of like what Prof was teaching me to do, and that I've been practicing since then, is like, and I think I used a lot of this to make the film too, which is to kind of take maybe energy. What energy is part of like the idea of like the spiritual senses, or senses that are beyond the way our five senses are defined. But like that part, we have the ability, we have in our sensorum the ability to kind of experience other elements of the world besides sight, sound, hearing, touch, and taste. And that often the way that manifests is it can feel like it's a little bit in the periphery, or like it's related to quiet and silence, in that you're sensing something that isn't like that idea of subtle energy or like gross energy or subtle body sensation. Like it's only apparent if you let what you're sensing in your periphery and kind of move it. That's what I experienced that lesson to be, is like come into a room, kind of start to sense what's right outside your immediate sense, and move it to the center, and use that rather than the like in meditation, in Vipassana meditation, they teach you about gross body sensation and subtle body sensation, and you only can get to subtle body sensation with kind of like a focused like practice of scanning over and over again, and starting to kind of devote attention towards sensation that isn't immediately apparent. So I think there is this like idea of developing your own sense to start to like take information that you're receiving in a more opaque way, that you're less sure of perhaps too, of like exactly what it is, and give attention to it and give power to it, and slowly move it into a place where like it's more in the center of your sensorum rather than kind of out of the corner of your eye. And I had this experience I have this experience composing and improvising often. I work in doing a lot of improvisation with dancers. And in doing the film as well, like doing larger compositional work, where something maybe feels a little bit like a shadow, or like it's calling to you from a place you can't quite see. And instead of just like ignoring that or saying this is like the information I don't need, actually like focusing on what that is and like letting it start to claim more and more space until it kind of presents itself in a more full and articulated way.
Amazing. I know that you have to go, Jake, but do you have time for one more question from Aldo? Okay.
Thank you, Jake, for this amazing movie. I want to ask you if you can get deep in the conception of Milford Graves about the metronome on the swing. You mentioned it in the movie, like a lot of, most of the doctors tell you to follow the metronome, and also when a beginner speed up or rush the pulse or the metronome pulse, is like, you are a beginner, you should keep, although you are maybe are nervous or maybe you are excited and you want to speed up or something. So this is really, I was surprised because some teachers tell you, you should study with metronome and sometimes without them. But it's the first time I heard somebody that you should not follow the metronome. So I was really curious about how he relate swing, because he talked about also this ostinato, no, like ting 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 ting, that we hear always. Always a lot of teachers tell you, this is the soul of the jazz, the ostinato, because you first should know how to play it. And now that I hear it in the movie, it was like, I was really surprised. Like, I'm a little bit shocked because it's like all the things that professors tell about it is like, no, you should not follow the metronome. So I don't know if you can explain a little bit deeper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aldo. Yeah, the metronome comes up a lot with Milford. I mean, one of the first private lessons I had was we recorded my heart, and he then analyzed it and sonified it through the LabVIEW program and created melodies. And then he gave me a CD with my heart as a recording, pitched up a little bit, and then a bunch of different translations or sonifications of my heart. And he said, throw away the metronome and just practice to this. And not unlike, the first time practicing to the percussion ensemble record, which also has a lot of shifts in tempo, it was liberating in the sense that, one, it was coming from me. It was my own body that was kind of the source of the sound, but that it also it created this expansive, this oscillating musical space to that felt it felt more expansive and more open to different creative approaches to practice. He talks a little bit in the movie and a lot everywhere else about the idea of heart rate variability, and like the idea that this, one of the major ostinatos of our body, the heartbeat, ding, 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 while it can average at a certain beats per minute and a specific type of pattern, that if it ever repeats that pattern exactly, it's a very dangerous condition, that the heartbeat needs to be in kind of this oscillating, expansive tempo range to be considered healthy, and that if it's not, then that's a sign of a major health problem. So in the movie, he goes on to talk about like the idea of like trying to walk across the street in a stepwise march, that like it's fine. That can work great for you if you are on an empty street. But if you're on a street with lots of traffic and lots of dynamic activity, that you're going to be in a big danger. And I think this goes to this idea of being in these kind of interrelated relationships with everything around you. That the heart has that oscillating quality because it's inside the body and it's in dialogue with the nervous system and the organs, and at times it needs to speed up or slow down inside that context of its interconnectedness with the other parts of the body, and that if it was just straight, that it can cause problems. So he basically was like extrapolating that fact into like a musical approach, and really like disturbing and attacking one of like the main foundations of like musical training and practice, of kind of like this idea that being able to keep a rhythm precise and steady and connected to like a mechanical device, how that kind of takes music out of its natural state, which would have a lot more of an oscillating quality. And he would have examples like of great, you know, he loved artists like Tito Puente and like, you know, classic hit records from Latin and Afro-Latin jazz from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, you know, he'd always show like the number one records start out at like 110 beats per minute and end at like 130 beats per minute, you know, and that, so that even in music that has like a lot of popular appeal, sometimes the energy builds and the tempo builds, and that's like perfectly okay. And I think like, you know, as far as like the ostinato, like there's a lot there, you know, about like what that rhythm is and like what swing is. The way he defines, you know, swing in the movie, which I love, is like has like a metaphorical quality of like what swing is like this desire to live to the next day, which is like to kind of be, you know, improvising with the things around you and surviving, like this idea of rhythm and survival. I think you can find a lot of examples like that from the African diaspora and the greater Caribbean. You know, I was listening to a lecture recently, someone from the Igbo tradition of drumming, who teaches at University of California, and he was talking about polyrhythm in the dance, where like the steps of the dance and the rhythm would be in a polyrhythmic relationship, kind of a 2 against 3 relationship. And he was talking about the way, in a kind of a concept of that polyrhythmic relationship, was that the step that was in kind of 2 was this like idea of like moving through the world and this like stepwise motion and like moving forward in your life. And then the 3 against it like represented all the things that come at you, and you know, you start out your day and then you have like something happens and you have to react to it, and that like the music isn't complete without both of those ideas, you know, without the idea of like your plans and then like the way that like life works, that like that those need to be in dialogue. And I think Milford was kind of saying something like this about swing, that's what swing is. Swing isn't a specific like ostinato pattern. It's like that ostinato pattern is emergent out of a sensibility of life, you know, that was present inside the musical culture that birthed jazz, which had direct relationships to musical culture, you know, in Africa and throughout and was still in dialogue in the greater Caribbean. And so, you know, I think the basic lesson is like throw away the metronome and listen to your heart. It has parallels to like the full mantis idea, like Jenny mentioned earlier, you know, that like that kind of your own creativity, your own sensorium is powerful enough and to rely on, and that when you find yourself in a situation where you don't have access to the information you feel like you need to develop in a certain way, that you can just turn back to your own senses and to your own direct experience of life, and use that as that's the real material. That everything else, like he says, I don't want to get a mantis that's through this other guy, because I think this has resonance to like ideas about ableism and the body, and kind of the way we kind of platform and highlight certain kinds of bodies and certain kinds of ways to be in the world. He says, I don't want to get the mantis from this person because maybe his joints move differently than my joints move. So I want to get the mantis directly from the mantis. And that way, when I put it together, I'm going to move the way my joints move and to do what my body can do. And if I sent Jenny, I think I sent Jenny my most recent film, which is his last concert before he died. And you can see there, his legs weren't moving, his arms weren't moving well, but he still did his music, and it was like it was like a classic example of like, I'm going to do this music the way my body does this music right now. I'm not going to try to do it the way my old body did it, and the music's incredible. It's like two notes and you're like, it's amazing. But I think I'll cut it there. I gotta go, but I hope that was like a good response to that question. And you can find so much in what's out there in interviews and things. There's a series on YouTube that's it was like a jazz history person at Brandeis, and they do these like 3-minute interviews with Milford in his basement. I'll send a link to Jenny, but there's like a whole series, and there's whole chapters on musical timing and rhythm and metronome. It's quite a recurring theme. But when he passed, we were all together at his house, and the newspaper, the Times and stuff, started calling for the obituary. And so his wife Lois asked us, everyone, to get together and come up with like what's the quote that should be sent. And so the one was like, throw away the metronome and listen to your heart, which I think was like a central touching point, and just kind of this faith in your own body and your own senses, and how powerful it is, and how beautiful it is, and how musical it is, that you can throw away these devices and rely on kind of your own sensibility. And I think not unlike meditative practices and like ideas of silence, there's a turning inwards,